Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast. I'm your host, Christian Harris. My guest today is Geoff Trickey, who created the risk type compass. Now, this is a fascinating personality profile, if you want to call it that. Perhaps that's doing it a bit of a disservice, but it's a survey effectively, and it gives you your risk type. And we talk about that and how it works in the discussion. Plots you on a couple of axes and then gives you one of 8 different risk types. And this helps to give you an insight to your risk appetite, how you see risk, how you're likely to act in different circumstances, and how you should interact with other people who have different risk types to you. So it's a really interesting discussion. I think this is a tool that anybody listening would benefit from implementing in their business to learn more about different people and how they're going to act and how they perceive risk. And I think it'll help you to consider processes and systems, but also how to interact with people and get the most out of people and manage the business to be as effective and clearly as safe as is reasonably practicable. If you want to take the test, see the show notes, because there's a link for a free access, and it'll give you a one-page summary which will tell you your risk type and a few key facts. And then if you're interested to go on from there, it's a paid-for service, so you can upgrade with a small fee to get the full report. And then if you were interested in talking to Geoff and his team about putting it into your business, then you can have that conversation as well. For those of you who are viewing this on YouTube, I apologise. We had a cutout of the video stream, but the conversation was going so well, I didn't want to stop it. So if you're watching on YouTube, you've got about 20 minutes of video and then it cuts out on Geoff's side. But for those of you listening on the podcast, then there's no such problems. As always, if you enjoy the episode and follow the podcast, please do hit subscribe. If we've earned it, we'd really love 5-star review, because that helps to get the word out. And if you know anybody that will be interested in listening, please share it with them. And equally, if you know anybody that would be interested in appearing as a guest, I'd be really keen to have that discussion as well. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. Over the next few weeks, we're doing a special selection of shows focusing on slips, trips and falls, because it's going to be September. And in my world, September is actually Sliptember, which is a month-long campaign to raise awareness about slip safety. So the podcast will be focused on that for a few weeks, and then coming back in October with a much broad range of safety and risk type of interviews. Hope that's all good. Look forward to connecting with you over Sliptember. And as I say, if you enjoy this, please do hit subscribe and give us a good review. With that then, let's get into it and join my conversation with Geoff Trickey. But normally it works pretty well. So.
It's if we get down a rabbit hole I worry about, because this, our interest in all of this is very broad. I mean, it's very philosophical at one end, and it goes into neuroscience and so on. I mean, there's a lot of ways we can take the debate, but I think from the point of view of your listeners, we want to stay pretty much in the health and safety zone.
Yeah,
we have things to say about that as well.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. All set then, Geoff?
It's a set. I just got to get rid of this little thing on the screen. There we go. Yeah. Okay.
It was probably asking if you're okay for it to be recorded, I imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a new feature. Okay. Geoff Trickey, welcome to the Safety and Risk podcast.
Hi, Christian. Thank you for inviting me.
It's good to have you today. Looking forward to this one. We'll get into the risk type compass, which I've done and found fascinating, and we're going to have a bit of a walk through some of my results, which will be interesting. But before we get into that, do you want to just give a very quick overview in terms of a bit of background and how you got to sort of where you are today?
Well, as far as risk and health and safety and risk in finance are concerned, that's the, I suppose, latest twist in the career. If I take it from there and go backwards, prior to that, main interest was in personality psychology and working within the world of work, so industrial psychology, occupational psychology, whatever you want to call it. Prior to that, I was in educational psychology, so working in the public sector. Set this business up 30 years ago. In actual fact, as most people, most entrepreneurs do, it's to start off in your own sitting room, on your own, and then gradually, you know, you go from there. Prior to that, it was a messy sort of early life, really, doing bits of this and bits of that. Done lots and lots of different jobs, but now very focused on risk in particular, because absolutely fascinating area, and a huge amount going on, and it's all very pertinent. I think the big picture on risk is, well, it's huge, isn't it? And as we know, we've just been through COVID for one. But internationally and so on, and where we're going with this, with our whole civilization is the very big picture, but we won't take that too far. But I mean, there's a big philosophical side to the whole subject, so it is a hugely fascinating, something very elaborate.
Yeah, it is, and that's one of the things I like about it, is that you can go really big picture and macroeconomic and so on, or you can drill it all the way down to, you know, what's the risk of me riding on the bus or crossing the road, and everything in between, and sort of every action, every decision, or every action we take without making a decision through habit or whatever, you know, there's a risk attached to all of that, isn't there?
Yes, it's called Franklin's Law. There's nothing certain in life except death and taxes, which is right. I think too, it's, you know, any endeavor, if you look at the legislation on this, and the point when legislation about safety flipped over, and I think the 1974 Act pretty much, and it turns out to be really, risk is anything harmful that comes out of any endeavor, virtually. And if you take that back even further, endeavor, whatever you're trying to do, determines your risk landscape. I mean, it's what's standing between you and what you're trying to achieve, whatever that is. And then that's survival at the end of the day. So it very quickly goes from a slip hazard or trip hazard to how do we survive? How does life survive as on this planet, in this universe? So yeah, that's from big picture down to zooming down to day-to-day details.
Yes,
exactly.
And another thing I'm always interested in is looking at from a corporate perspective. You know, you've started a business, I've started a business. To do that, you've got to take risk, and you've got to you know, put yourself out there and so on. But then there's this journey that businesses seem to go on, and when there's a kind of a tipping point at which they reach a certain size, and then all of a sudden risk becomes bad rather than good, and then it's all about sort of the negative connotations of risk rather than the positive side of risk. So trying to bring that positivity out is something that I'm quite keen on as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with that entirely, and I suppose that's what enterprise risk, or that term, is meant to imply, and it doesn't realize, actually, does it? I mean, I think at the end of the day, people are, the risk averse side of people is a very strong aspect of individual differences, but it's also the end that commands our attention. And I think in sort of survival terms as a species, it was the people who say, no, don't do that. You can't do that. We'll all get killed, whatever. That sort of voice has always been loud. And if it wasn't, and people didn't pay attention to risk, they got wiped out anyway, I guess, in the early days of, you know, when life was extremely dangerous at that point. But yeah, there's lots to be fearful of. Yeah,
no, absolutely. So Geoff, could you give us a quick overview of the business then, and what you do, and then we'll start diving into the compass of it.
Yeah. Well, we're business psychologists, so we're excited about applying psychology to issues that arise in organizations and in the workplace. So that's a very exacting environment to work in. You're looking for actual real results. It's not airy-fairy. We're not interested in abstract ideas. Well, we kind of can, but in terms of our application and our offering to different organizations, it's about how do we solve this problem. And it's mainly about, I guess, people, and we're coming at it from individual differences point of view. So whether we're talking about a toxic team in an organization, or a very senior appointment or a very critical appointment, or whatever difficulties may be arising within the organization, our question is, has psychology got something to offer here? Is there something that is already recognized as a psychological contribution, or is it something that could usefully be looked at from a psychological point of view? And so in that sort of context, we work from a research point of view. So we will work with organizations in order to try to apply psychological approaches in a scientific way, in a methodical, systematic sort of a way. And that's really the origins of the risk type compass. The particular issue that had arisen was that the regulators were saying to financial advisors, you should not be selling products to your clients or recommending products for their portfolio without understanding their risk appetite, which was a very sound point to make. But at that point, there was no way of doing it. I mean, there was actually no way of assessing, nothing existed that would tell you very much about your risk disposition. So the consequence of that was that a lot of questionnaires with as few as 3 or 4 questions. Do you like taking risks? Do you really like taking risks, sort of thing? And they were very transparent. And of course, within the industry, they didn't have much credibility, and they were a nuisance, and it was something that you're going to have to do with your client, but because the regulators required it, so it would be done and put on the file. But there wasn't really a very systematic way of doing that. So that was the origin. We had a wealth management client that we'd done some work with over time and knew them well. And our response to that, well, personality is full of risk themes, I mean, the biggest factor in personality that relates to risk, and the most obvious one, would be neuroticism, because that is neuroticism is about being fearful, being anxious, being apprehensive. It's all about how you react to risk, how you respond. So we went from there to say, well, okay, there is a taxonomy of personality, which is very pragmatic. That's the 5-factor model. It is a panoramic view of personality. It covers the whole thing. So we're going to go into that. And this is with their backing. This is a research project. We're going to identify all the themes, be over-inclusive in personality that may have a bearing on risk. So that was the strategy we adopted. I mean, it's just a word about the 5-factor model. It's consensual. When I started off as a psychologist, there were many, many very different views on personality and what it was, and many ways of trying to measure things that people weren't consensual about. The 5-factor model is just it is absolutely consensual. It's very pragmatic. It's really looking at all the language that we use to describe each other and validating that and factor analyzing that and boiling it down to these 5 key factors. So that's briefly where our starting point was. So we did have this orderliness about personality that we could address. And so we went through all of the themes that everybody was addressing when they were writing personality questionnaires, and we picked out anything that we thought could affect the way people make decisions or react to risk or to danger and so on. And then we got data on that, and then we factor analyzed it. And as soon as we saw that data, we said, compass, that's a compass. We had 4 factors, and those 4 factors, it's amazing. And they were really clean factors. I mean, when you do factor analysis, also stray bits of this and that get attached to the construct that you're talking about. But this was a very clean structure. So we took it from there. And because we were talking about producing something that would be intuitive and that people could understand easily, because the problem with personality questions, you can come up with an explanation, but then someone's got to do something with that. So we wanted to be very pragmatic, to have a very clear language, and to be really usable. I mean, that was the important thing, because if it's going to be of any use to people, they've got to get their head around it very quickly. So the compass model underpinned what we did, and we developed 2 scales joining those 4 points. And those 2 scales mapped incredibly well onto the research into decision making. So decision making from a neurological point of view is regarded as involving 2 neurological systems. One of those is emotion. So that's from fear to fearlessness, if you like. And people do range from that. There are people who are petrified of almost anything. They won't go out of the house and without being, very, very, very anxious, extreme. Yeah. It interferes with their life. And you've got people at the other end who just are completely oblivious, and they just show no reaction to frightening situations, except, oh, that's interesting, sort of thing. So that was that scale. The other scale is cognition, that is considered to be important. And within the context of risk and risk taking, that takes pretty much the form of the need to know, what am I getting into? What is going on here? Have I checked it all out in absolute detail? How sure can I be that that really is the situation? Yeah. So that's the cognitive dimension. And those 2, statistically, they are orthogonal. That means they don't correlate with each other. So it seems that we have tapped into something fairly fundamental that does relate to the neuroscience on decision making. And if you cross them, it gives you the 2 axes to the risk type compass. Yeah. And so we have 8 risk types, because on either of those 2 scales, you can score anywhere. And that means you could be extremely emotionally risk sensitive, and you could also be, from a cognitive point of view, you could be someone who won't do anything unless you know absolutely everything about it. So there are 2 reasons for being risk averse. So if you combine those, that gives you the intermediate risk types. So that's the logic. We haven't just picked out, a bunch of the vocabulary and say, what should we call this? What should we call this? It was entirely driven by the science and by the research and everything that was known about decision making. And I think that's why it's proved to be so sound. I mean, it is a remarkable instrument in terms of its reliability. The reliability of both those scales is above 0.9, which in psychometrics terms is unheard of. I don't know another instrument that achieves that. And what it means is, whatever we're measuring it extremely accurately, because it's coming back. And if you take it again and again, you'll get the same. You'll probably end up almost exactly in the same place. So that was the origin of it. And then that gives you a vocabulary of 8 risk types, because in actual fact, they're not risk types, because as a compass, like any compass, it's a 360-degree spectrum, and you can increment it all the way around, and we do. But for the sake of communication, I mean, if you had a clock or a compass that you didn't articulate or name various points, it would be useless. But and I make that point because people don't like typologies, and that's just putting people in boxes, and there's some truth in that. So that isn't the point. The point is, if you are, I think on your particular profile, you sit right in the middle of a segment. So you're in the middle of the segment. But if you'd have been a bit to the left or a bit to the right, it would be a different interpretation. So we are incrementing the full 360 degrees, but we're using the terminology so that we can communicate. And obviously, if you're going to use this in any work setting, and you're going to be using it from people from the board right down to the shop floor, then it's got to be something that everybody can easily understand. You need the vocabulary that goes with it.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I obviously took the test, and the questions were very easy to understand. Most of them didn't require a huge amount of thought. Some of them were kind of, which are you most likely to do, which are you least likely to do, with a few options, and so you did need to put a bit of thought into that. But it was very simple, and I really liked the 2 axes, because again, very simple, very clear and easy to understand. you didn't know about this before, somebody explains the two axes. Oh yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, I thought it was, a very, very, very solid report and a very good test. Is it worth just running through the 8 risk types and just giving a quick, perhaps?
Let's take them in opposites, because I think the striking thing about risk type is it's stunning how different people are. I'll just make this point. I think when we interact with each other, we almost instinctively deceive each other. We always try to be more like the person we're talking to than we really are. And even to the point where people will say, well, if you're meeting for the people the first time, for goodness sake, don't talk about religion or politics. So the idea is avoid any initial, tensions. So I think people go through life really thinking people are much more like themselves than they really are. And we are, in a way, our own baseline. I mean, when I meet somebody, if I'm going to say that they're sociable or not sociable, that's in relation to what I am to a degree. So there's that side. There's that side to it. I've lost my point now. Where was I going?
We were going to run through the types, but in opposites, so the pairing up of them.
So the important point is that is an illusion. People are dramatically different, and that comes home to us when we look at the newspapers or the shock stories and so on, and you say, how the hell did that happen? That's amazing. Which is, I suppose, what drives newspapers to have extreme interpretations of event all the time. So they love anything that's going to get everybody worked up and fearful, and that's pretty much what they do. But so taking them at their opposites, then I think it illustrates the extremes. And if you look at the extremely, as I've suggested already, going from the top left of the compass to the bottom right, you've got a scale there that starts off with people who are very anxious and very fearful. And at the bottom right, they're imperturbable. So you're talking about the intense risk type at one end of the scale. And at the other end of the scale, you've got people who are so calm, they're oblivious. So they're composed, they're very composed. And these are things, you meet people who just don't react to things. They're so composed. They don't seem to have a vocabulary for anything further down the other side of the scale. Anyway, so that's those two. Very, very calm people and people who are highly reactive. Whatever. When I say highly reactive, if you clap your hands like that, it's physical. If you got them in a car with you and went round a corner, maybe you drive a little bit fast, but you'll feel them. It's physiological. You'll feel them tense up, and they'll make noises because oh gosh, and things like that. So that's the one extreme. If you take the other main axis, then you're talking about prudent people compared to people who are carefree. So that's another two types. These are the core types, really. So the prudent type are people who won't go into anything without really looking into it in detail. And that can be to an extraordinary degree. So they tend not to make decisions very quickly because they're never quite sure they've got enough information. It might always worth deferring decision a little bit longer. We just might get a bit more information on this before we make a decision. At the other end, so those people are very risk averse from a cognitive point of view. They're not. It's not their emotion. No. It's not that they're fearful, but they're kind of troubled by going into any situation which isn't very clear to them. So that's the prudent risk type. And the opposite of that is carefree. They love going into situations where they don't know what's happening. They love it when things get disruptive and chaotic. And so whereas the prudent type see risk in everything and they want to turn over every stone to check there isn't something mysterious underneath it, at the other end, the people who are carefree can't wait. They love the chaos because they can see the opportunities something different's going to happen, something exciting, something I can get excited about. They need, getting excited about things is fundamental to their nature. I don't mean that. I mean, you can read that in a silly sort of way. I don't mean that, but it's physiological in both cases. It's what turns you on. It makes you alert. It switches on all your antennae and makes you really alert.
Yeah. So for example, I can remember in my first couple of weeks of university, going to the student union, and I had a sort of sense of melancholy because I realised that in 4 years' time, because I had a 4-year degree, I was almost certainly going to be doing the same thing in exactly the same place, and that was kind of frustrating to me because I was, I'm keen to do new things and have new experiences. Yeah.
I've got a parallel story to that. Is a guy who was very, very good at art at school and not good at much else. And they was being encouraged to go to art school and couldn't even contemplate it because the idea of doing an art lesson every day, all day, just sounded dreadful. So, yes, that's exactly the kind of thing. So that's the four main ones, and then the other ones between are a mixture. So if you go to the top of the compass, you've got where you have got your intense risk type on the left, and on the right you've got your prudent risk type. Now suppose you're both of those. Now that's really quite fascinating. We call that a wary risk type, but they are people who want everything to be under control, but with passion. It's turbo boosted by their fears and their anxieties. So you can imagine being orderly and being just a calm, orderly person, but then inject that with urgency and fear and anxiety. And it makes wary risk types very controlling because they don't trust you to make sure that you turn the gas off or you shut the door. They want to do it all themselves because that's the only way they can be really sure that it's been done properly. They make terrible passengers, but they want to drive. And when they drive, that doesn't mean they won't drive fast. I know somebody who is a wary risk type who's had at least 3 speed awareness training, but is a dreadful passenger. So that's the kind of the paradox. So you get those two. So that's the wary risk type. So they're risk averse for 2 reasons. When we talk about people being risk averse, there's an assumption that it's just one thing. No, there are 2 reasons for being risk averse. One is emotional and one's cognitive. One's needing to know everything and also being passionate about it. So that's your wary risk type. And at the bottom, the adventurous risk type, we've got 2 reasons why they take risk. So on the one hand, they want the excitement. They don't turn on until something is quite exciting and interesting to them and wakes them up and makes them pay attention. And on the other hand, they're oblivious. They're not, well, we say, I'm talking about extremes here. So I'm making this is a bit of a...
And be careful because I'm in this category, so don't be too scared then.
Yes. Well, but the risk-taking, at that point, because it's not because they necessarily are gung-ho adventurous in that sense, but it's because they're not tuned into emotionally in a fearful way, in an emotionally reactive way. So although they will, I describe the adventurous risk type, particularly if you're extreme, as the last person to leave the building when it's on fire, or they're the person handing out the life jackets when the ship goes down, because they're organized and systematic, and they're just the situation doesn't make them incapable of managing it. Their calmness will keep them doing practical and useful things as the ship goes down, almost, if you like. And you can see that so there's 2 reasons for being risk averse and 2 reasons for being risk taking, and one is emotional and the other is cognitive. And then the in-between ones, where they combine. The interesting ones at the side, really, and they're all very interesting, but the fascinating ones are the case where you're risk averse from an emotional point of view, but you're risk taking from a cognitive point of view. So that's your excitable risk type on the left, because there's tension within that, because from an emotional point of view, you're worried and you're fearful, but you still want the excitement. So we used to describe that as being like a moth to a flame. You're attracted to things that are going to kill you, So there's that sort of allure. That's rather, and it's a bit of a cliche way of describing it, and it's actually very much more complicated than that, but you can see it, and you can see it's associated with people who will take risks, but when those risks don't succeed, they're mortified. They're really broken up. And so the excitable risk type would be like that. And on the opposite side, the prudent risk type they want everything to be completely orderly and systematic, but they're completely composed. So there's a contradiction there, because being composed means you're risk taking. You're not put off from doing things because they're frightening. You will do them, but you will do them in a super organized way if you're a deliberate risk type on the right. And so what we find is, and you've probably seen this if you've read any of our literature, this absolutely is an air traffic controller. Yeah. Air traffic controllers do a job which would keep me awake at night, really. The idea I've got to go in to work in the morning and bring down another 40 Dumbo jets full of happy holiday makers, and oh my God, and stack them and tell them what to do, and it's all down to me, you know. But they can do that, but they can't, they will do it because they've got an exact procedure for everything. So the prudent side is the procedure, and the risk-taking side is the composure. So that means they're not going to be, in a moment of crisis, they're not going to lose it. They will continue to use the processes and the principles they've got. And the fascinating thing about that is that if you look at the data, we've got a huge amount of data on air traffic controllers, and vast majority of them are in that segment. In the other, they bleed over to the neighboring segments. So there's some who are just prudent and some who are just composed. But 75% of them are in the deliberate risk type. And nearly all the rest are just over the margins into those other risk types. And then if you look at, we split that up as a sort of pizza diagram. The others take up a tiny little segment, and all the other risk types are in there. Yeah. I suppose, you know, maybe it's a point to make here is that organizations really need a mixture of these types. It's not, you know, you find even I've sort of characterized air traffic control as being very, very similar, and they are. And there's, to some degree, you will find auditors will be very similar, and so on. For different professions, there'll be a predominance of a risk type, but there is never to that same degree. No. So it's much more varied. And the point my colleague makes is that we're all risk takers in the end. You have to be, because that's life. You've got to, it's not that whether you take risk in the end, but how, and how you deal with it and how you manage it, or whether you run away from it. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I thought was interesting, looking at some of the information you sent to me, so I'm adventurous, sort of in the center of adventurous, and then I was looking at some of the job types and where people tend to sit on the compass, and it had lawyers as being wary, which is the opposite of me, and my wife's a lawyer, so I thought that was quite interesting that we're sort of potentially polar opposites. Well, that happens a lot. I've got a theory about that if you're interested in it, but I think opposites attract because we don't understand them. So, you know, we always interpret each other through our own, you know, parameters or whatever, through our own, you know, particular viewpoint from where we are. And I think if I'm sure you get on very well with people who are like you, adventure sites will. But I think opposites are particularly intriguing because they intrigue us, I think. I mean, they are different, and we know they're different. And I think there's we also misrepresent them. You know, a wary risk type will probably characterize you as a gung-ho, you know, daring, terrifying person who's, you know, like Tarzan or something in the world. And in reverse happens as well. So you look, I mean, my guess would be your wife organizes the holidays and books the hotels and looks at all the timetables, make sure the transfers really will work, and confirms that the deposit was paid on time, whereas you probably don't. No. And so they are complementary. So that's a really important point. I mean, when you know, as a species, we've developed in this way. Clearly, we have. So they have always been, I mean, they weren't classified in this way, but there has always been that diversity of risk. There's always been the people who say, no, 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 don't do that, you'll get us all killed. And those who say, come on, let's get out there and kill one of those, you know. So, and that works out, it works out. And what it means is that in terms of risk strategies, we've got masses of them. And if you're a spider, you only have one, and it's called a web. You know, that's your risk, that's your survival strategy. In humanity, we've taken over the world. We live in every part of the globe, regardless of how cold it is or how hot it is, how wet it is or whatever, we're there. And my take on that is we do it because Team Homo sapiens is a great team. It's got strikers, it's got defenders, if you want a football analogy. It's got people who see an opportunity and go for it, whilst the others are saying, oh, I don't like what you're doing. Be careful, be careful. And, you know, so it's been a profound influence on our ability to master our environment is that we have this ability. So although opposite risk types may disagree, and that's obviously an issue, and particularly on a board, I mean, if you've got people who are very different, and particularly you've got a faction of 2 or 3 like this and 2 or 3 like that, then people are at each other's throats, or they take it personally. They say, oh, I can't understand why you're always on my case. Every time I bring up a proposal, why is it always you? You know, and that's the sort of negative side of it. Positive side of it is if you can turn that into recognizing the positivity of having a team that's diverse, then in decision-making terms, that's terrific. You know, there's, I don't know if you've seen you know, The Room Where It Happened. There's the song, The Room Where It Happened, and it was the musical, isn't it?
Also.
Yeah, that's right. So who's in the room when it happened? And Hamilton, who's in the room where it happened? And that was, you know, its own sort of theme. But that's the same with COVID. Who's making these decisions? Who is it? And what do we know about them? Well, we might know they're head of this and they've had that career and so on. What risk type are they, though? I mean, are they all totally off the scale risk averse in every way? Or, you know, the reassurance would be, we're particularly on a board, that you've got some degree of diversity, that you've got people who will contribute, and also that you, I mean, if you take that in, add to that a dose of mutual respect, so that you can understand that other people will have a different view, and you can appreciate the value of having a complementary point of view, then that's a strength. That's no doubt a strength. I mean, you know, if you've got something like Enron, where everyone's an adventurous risk type, I imagine, I don't know, this is just taking liberties with what little bit we know, but Enron just drove off a cliff. I mean, it was just so ludicrously risk-taking in the end. I mean, just the whole thing, and so optimistic. I mean, that's the other side of risk takers. They're totally sure that if, you know, things will work out all right in the end. But, you know, so yeah, it's very reassuring that in terms of who's in the room where it happened. If you have got a board, or if you're setting up, for example, a working party on safety at work, that you've got something that represents the total workforce. There's no point in just saying, well, let's get a bunch of really prudent people and put them in charge of this working party on, because, you know, that's going to be crazy. Everyone never will take their hard hat off, and they'll wear a high-vis jacket wherever they go.
Yeah, and nothing will ever happen, because you can't, you know, I've had this discussion many times on the podcast about companies that say safety is our #1 priority, when it's impossible for safety to be your #1 priority, because if it were, you'd never do anything. You know, you have to have some risk to
always be, wait a minute, I'm not ready yet, just to check something else out. Yeah, I think then, I mean, so that, I don't know if you know Sidney Dekker, probably you do, and his sort of approach to what should happen in terms of health and safety. And is it Hal Nagel? Is that the right way to pronounce it? There's another guy who talks about safety 1 and safety 2. There's this other notion about health and safety, and it tends to have been viewed as being very sort of authoritarian, very top down, very rule bound in every way, and that everyone understands that in a really dangerous situation like a foundry or something like that, with molten metal splashing around all over the place. But the point is that having people aware of their own risk disposition puts them in a position where they can make more sense of what needs to be done. You see what I mean? I think if you imagine recruiting into an environment like that, which is extremely risk critical, people who are all risk takers from a risk type company's point of view, then that's not a good thing. I mean, what you would like is a diversity, but the point is, it is good to have some, because you need people who will point out the ludicrousness of going through all that sort of process to no benefit to anybody, and how better to do it. So I think people's awareness of their own risk type makes them able to take responsibility, and therefore ultimately to take discretionary decisions when they are sensible things to do. I've worked with risk type in a very heavy industry sort of context. And what we did was and I think this is like organizational change really, you have to start at the top. So you start with the board and the execs, and say, well, this is what it's about. It's about you, and the instrument finds credibility. People find it credible. And then you do the same as this, and then you do it down the various chains. So we took the maintenance function all the way down to the shop floor. And that was really moving. I mean, when we got down to the shifts coming off work, and these people were in a very, very high risk environment, in the first place, they resented management because they said, well, all these health and safety, it's just to keep them, their backs covered. It's nothing to do with us. They don't care about us, really. That was the attitude. And they would always come up with some ludicrous health and safety requirement about changing a light bulb, and having a harness, having to be clipped onto something structural, So those sorts of things. But it was quite moving because they were very interested in their own risk type. So what we were doing with them is helping them just to understand that, but then to try to work out how that works out within the workplace. What aspects of health and safety are a challenge for you? Not saying there shouldn't be a challenge, there is a challenge, but tuning them to the fact that there are some things that they can take into account in their own nature, which will make their colleagues safer, apart from anything else. But also, that approach, I believe, leads to a situation where people can ultimately, if they're very experienced, if they've been doing that job for the last 20 years, they don't need someone with a clipboard to say you broke this subsection rule, blah, 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 blah. That person will have earned the right to make discretionary decisions, because sometimes in a critical situation, you have to. You've got to act then. You can't, and do what's sensible. You want people to do that at that point. And you understand what I was saying? Well, why did you just stand there and let that happen? Because the rules said so, that's what I'm supposed to do. So I think there's just as I said earlier on the boards, you can turn conflict into positivity by recognizing the benefit, the complementary benefit of different risk types and how they can all help. Football team is a great example of that. You need strikers who see everything as an opportunity. You need defenders who, whenever they get beyond the halfway line, feel like, oh God, I've left the door open, or I've left the gas on, like that, the mentality. So you need that in the workforce, and then as a whole. But then as individuals, if you really want people to make their best efforts, then you need to recognize that they have a different difficulty. It's not the same for everybody. It's no point when someone for the fourth time violates that walkway and they take a shortcut from here to there, that you make them go back on another health and safety course, which is the same one they went on when they were inducted, because that's not going to get you anywhere. If you can say to them, well, if you can help them to understand what's their risk type, and that they're going to do things because they're not doing it out of daredevilness or disobedience. They're doing it out of the fact that they're just not alert to it. They're not tuned into it in the same way as someone who's risk averse would be. Do you see what I mean? So your risk type turns your risk antennae on in different times at different points.
Yeah.
So just being aware of that. And we found it was really, really good. They apart from anything else, the shop floor people loved it. They never get that kind of attention. That's all for managers. That's all for senior supervisors and things like that. So you could see how that is a positive move to change a culture.
Yeah, a very good tool in the armory, because there is a big movement around trying to engage the workforce more and actually, think of work as it's actually done rather than work as imagined, and trying to be more on side with the shop floor. So this would be a great tool for anybody listening in to implement and learn more about their colleagues and how they can support them to achieve better safety outcomes. So if we think about my type then as adventurous, what does that mean in terms of, are there things I should be wary about, or how could I perhaps use that knowledge now that I have got that risk type to my advantage, and to look at the positive side of it?
Well, do you want this as marital guidance, or is this in your role?
probably best to avoid too much marital guidance on the podcast. But,
no, I think I'd be treading on very sensitive territory, wouldn't I? But I think the point is that number one is about being aware of what other people are that you're working with, and be aware that you won't get the same reaction to your enthusiasm for this harebrained idea that you're willing to pursue further and invest time and energy in, and others are not. And to recognize, and just to be able to, your relationships with other people, if you know what their risk type is, or even knowing the taxonomy, because you can pretty much guess. You've learned to recognize extreme calmness, for example. That's one I've definitely learned to identify, and lack of emotion. So some people just don't have the emotional range of reaction. It's very narrow, and to appreciate that. And it's not that they're not enthusiastic, but they don't express enthusiasm. They don't express excitement because they don't have it. So it's no good trying to urge them to display the kind of enthusiasm that you might be able to display for the ideas that may come up. So it's one thing. So it's recognizing the four types educate you into what you're dealing with other people, and sensitize to make you much more sensitive to how people are and why they're responding the way they do. That's one thing. From the other point of view, you've got to recognize that you will terrify other people. So if you're working, with people, for example, wary and very emotional, or very prudent, and particularly in the health and safety industry, it's very easy to unsettle other people, and then it loses credibility. You lose contact with them, and they may, depending on your situation, if you're in a position of authority and you're doing it, then you're enforcing people to live in a world that's tolerable to you, but it's not to them. I'm just thinking about it. Sorry, my thought was going to war type situations, but there's the sort of incompetence of the way wars are run and so on, and there's lots of literature on that. But you've got a situation there where you've got leaders who are absolutely sure this is the way to do it, and this is what we're going to do, and they do it until there's no one left. They just cannot abandon that strategy. And that's they don't have the flexibility to do that. I think it's a mistake to think, though. We resist the idea that your risk type stops you doing a particular job, because what it says is, if you know what your limitations are in respect of some aspects of the job, then that is not necessarily an issue. I think when you get very extreme types, then maybe there's more of a problem, because any extreme personality dimension, whichever it is, sort of enters an area of where things can go wrong. I'm not finding the right word exactly that I want for it, but that's what it means. If you're an extremely extrovert person, then you may be driving people nuts because you're never calm and quiet and so on. And so any extreme personality coaches, whatever, and it's the same for risk types. I think if you're really at the absolute limit, then you need to look at what may, in general, make you a bit sort of toxic in some situations.
And that's when bringing, as you say, the whole team in and having that balance struck between the different members of the team. So, a board, as you said earlier, it is a sensible strategy.
Yeah, I would be very interested if anybody listens to your podcast who has access to the Premiership football clubs and so on. I'd love to do a research project which involves assessing. I mean, probably you wouldn't be able to do it with the Premiership team itself, the first team, but you could possibly do it with the under-21s or whatever, the younger people in the academy. Because I think it would be very fascinating. In sport, you have a huge amount of data. And this risk type is absolutely amazing when we do validity studies because it's so reliable. It means that it highlights any correlation that is there. Because it correlates so well with itself, it has the capacity to correlate, which other less reliable instruments can't. Yeah. So in terms of football, when I listen to football commentaries, I think you're talking risk type. Yeah. You talk about what's a natural defender, or what's
interesting.
Why is it that that striker once they've missed, everybody else is running back because you've now lost possession because they just hit it wide, but the striker is there sort of shaking his head and not getting on his bike and getting back to defend. Because he's a striker, that's what they are, and so I think it'd be very, very, very interesting. And I can't say, I wouldn't predict what's the outcome. Although the head of research here has drafted a paper suggesting what the different risk types might mean to different players. But I mean that's an analogy also for working as a team within an organisation. Yeah, that's the important point, really.
No, that's it. Well, interestingly, a couple of my clients are Premier League football teams, and also I'm quite well connected in the sort of sports and leisure world. So it might be something to have a conversation with Sport England about, or something like that, because that would be an interesting project to take forward.
Yeah, we'd be prepared to do that on a research basis. In terms of the cost of doing the assessment, say that way. But
Okay, great. Well, Geoff, I'm conscious of time, and you've been very generous with your time so far. But before we wrap up, I'd love to just give the audience some information in terms of where they can go to learn more, who they need to speak to arrange to take the test and to get their risk type compass results, etc.
Okay, the website is a good source. We have a huge amount on the website, and there's a knowledge bank there, which we are currently doing something like 16 research projects relating to risk type, and we have a history of that. And so there's a lot of information relating it to different things like creativity, like resistance to change, and so on, a lot of stuff. So that's where to look for it. If you want to take the risk type compass, then you can just call us. If you phone our front desk, they will give you an access code so that you can complete the risk type compass. And we can also arrange to do feedback, because there's a fee for this. But then but if you keep your eye on the website, there's also from time to time an opportunity to do to take an assessment and to get a simple one-page report, which is sometimes something that we offer. We can send you an access code that you could give out to your listeners so that they could do that. I mean, that would be fine. If you give you an access code, if your followers put that into, they'll give you a URL to go to complete the risk type compass, and they will get free of charge just a one-pager. It'll tell them have the graphic, that simple graphic, show them where the dot is, and it'll give us some explanation.
Perfect. Well, we'll put that into the show notes, as they're called, with the notes below the bottom of the podcast, and then people can do that. And I'd certainly recommend it. I found it very interesting. Even just going through the process and answering the questions makes you, have pause for thought, which obviously is part of the benefit and the reason of doing it. So yeah, I'd certainly recommend that to people. Great. Well, Geoff, I really appreciate it. Found it very fascinating. Thank you very much. And best of luck with all of the research, and we'll see if we can get you in touch with a football team.
That'd be brilliant. Okay, Chris, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Enjoyed talking to you.
Cheers.